loud. All right. And Ham, I'm going to turn it over to you and mute myself. Thanks for being here.
All right, thank you. I hope everybody can hear me okay. I'm going to jump into sharing my screen. 1 second. And I'm desperately worried about not making it through the content today. And I'm not going to lie, I haven't really tested how long this is going to take. So if I have to speed up during like the code samples, we'll just do that. But otherwise, I'm going to kind of jump through these slides, which are more or less, if you hate really playing slides with things that are off-centered, you're going to hate this whole presentation. But in general, yeah, I'm kind of like a full stack engineer. I've worked at really big companies and small companies. I tend to prefer younger companies though, more startup oriented stuff, SaaS products. I currently am at Fleetio, where I am, I think of myself as a full stack engineer, but I have specifically been focused on the front end, at least over the last year. And previously, I do come more from the Rails world. I was at a company, another startup that did a massive migration to, like a decoupled Rails backend and React application on the front end. So I've been doing React about 5 years now, and the way I think about building things in React has evolved over that time. And as a precursor, I may be like many of you, or maybe some of you are like me, who knows, that's a big question. But when I started doing React, I felt like I basically, took similar patterns to what I was doing on the back end, maybe taking templates and, kind of, you can imagine like an ERB template or a PHP template, and kind of just doing that now in React components. And really that wasn't very valuable. And now my mindset is much more component driven, and it's taken time for me to get there. And I think it's one of those things that you can read about all day, but until you kind of go through the practice of developing really decoupled components, like you may not think about it. So real quick, this is what we're going to kind of go over. And really this is component driven development for dummies. I think if you're an advanced React developer, you probably either do this consciously or subconsciously. This isn't necessarily how you approach all of your React development work. It's more of like a tool to use at times. But I think it's a tool that if you use in the right ways frequently enough, it will make all of the stuff that you build on the front end better, specifically around like your React stuff. So first, let's just start with a question. What is a component? Then we'll kind of go through an overview of at least what I mean by component-driven development. I want to do 2 quick segues at that point to define what a feature component is and a presentational component. And that's something that maybe some of you are familiar with already. Then I'm going to talk about TDD, because then I'm using TDD as the analogy to introduce CDD for dummies. Then I have some code samples, which hopefully we can get through quickly, and then questions, and I have some links at the end if y'all want the slide. So what is a component? Most people would probably describe it as some type of reusable front-end modular thing, right? It's like a piece of UI that you can use. But really, like, even if you define it in some slightly different ways, that's not like helpful when it comes to building a component. And so then people will usually take a visual approach to describing components, right? You'll maybe see some articles on Medium or some developer site, and they'll take something like this and they'll start slicing it up into little boxes and say, oh, well, those are components, right? But at least in the React world, if I'm going through this page and trying to identify what's a component, well, the page is a component and it's made up of components, right? These are some higher level components of some sort, or, maybe some of these are more functionally oriented and some of these are more visual, higher level components, or it's a combination of both. And we kind of skipped that there's probably some components here for handling the layout, but let's ignore that, because those components are also made up of components, and those are made up of components. And then there's some more in there too, which leads me to basically say that what is a component? Everything is a component. And as Dan Abramov tweeted at one point, if everything is a component, then nothing is a component, right? Because you look at this like, okay, those are all components. How do I get my application to a point where our code base actually reflects what I think should be a component on the page, right? Because that's the difficulty. That's ultimately the problem. And then to circle back on this quote, Dan Abramov didn't say it, I said it. And that's just how clueless I am in everyday life, constantly, thinking about stupid things. So really CDD is about, we need a pragmatic approach to get our code base to this point that we can look at it and not be, we can look at it visually and not be ashamed to know that, actually 5 of these components are coupled together. They can't be reused over there. Like we want it to be to the point where it is this decoupled and there is this much composition of components going on. And that's hard to achieve even in the best of cases. I mean, if you just consider like the average development life cycle of an everyday feature, a lot of times, even if you're getting like a perfect feature spec, there's still other external things going on that might lead you to cut corners, or maybe you don't have the full scope of future requirements, or you make some wrong abstraction, which that happens all the time, and that's okay. But CDD is about giving you a way to develop those features in a way that you're at least trying to, hedge your bets and set yourself up for being more like this later on. So there's a process for that, right? That's what I want to talk about today, which is component-driven development. So if we were defining component-driven development at a high level, this is where I'm going to start reading from slides a little bit, so ignore me. Or don't ignore me, but ignore that I'm reading from the slide. So component-driven development, it ultimately means you're building software in a highly or a loosely, a highly decoupled or a loosely coupled way. And this is obviously much bigger than the front end, especially as you get into larger and larger organizations. This becomes increasingly important, which I want to talk about more. But in the context of React and the UI in general, like this component mindset really is about enabling composition of higher level components or composite components, and the modularity is critical. And you get that modularity and that composition through good decoupling. And so when I'm talking about decoupling here, obviously, like if we're in React, like we're going to have some super high coupling to, whatever state management tool we might use, or React itself, or if we're building with hooks. That's one of the scariest things about hooks to me is I look at my code and I'm like, wow, this is never not going to be this anymore. But with that said, within the context of the application we're working on, we do need to ensure a high level of decoupling where we can between components themselves, and really getting that prop API figured out. So that's what I'm kind of referring to when I say decoupling within the context of React. And I want to just talk a little bit more about decoupling in general, because that's really why we see a lot of these trends maybe in the last, it's probably longer than the last 10 years, but a whole lot of talk about microservices or nano services on the back end. Even GraphQL is sort of related to this. A huge, surge in component-based stuff. React has gotten insanely popular. Single-page applications, even when people shouldn't be making single-page applications. I even know people that are working on projects now. I've worked on one where there's like micro applications within the single page app that you have to load and inject on the fly, with all these, it's made up of all these smaller repositories. I mean, it's just crazy, but it makes sense, because the larger that either your application or your team or your company gets, you really, a lot of the idea is that you want your projects to reflect kind of the organization of the people, and make it sure that as this project gets larger and larger, you can still rapidly change certain portions of the project to changing requirements. And so in the React world, that's like, if I have a massive multiple thousands of components in one repository, I want to be able to go to a certain workflow and change that experience dramatically, because it's an improvement for a customer, and I don't want to be limited because I'm coupled by some global CSS style sheet, or I'm coupled by bad component design. And this is a little lower level, but that's also why in the React world, CSS and JavaScript has gotten so popular, and concepts such as like co-location of code. It's ultimately, I think the biggest driver is about that decoupling. So I'm obviously like decoupling a lot. And then, the big thing I also want to highlight with this is that CDD is not meant to, and that's why I'm going to bring up TDD later. CDD is meant to be more pragmatic to what it's like building the UI. You know, most developers that do front-end development, I know there's a lot of iteration between code editor and the screen, or browser inspector and the screen, and you're kind of visually tuning a lot of times what you're building. And so this is a process that's actually kind of built to encourage that, but you do it in a way that you're still building code that's easy to maintain, easy to test, you know, gives you more of an opportunity for composition. And I put this in quotes, but if you do this as a team and you have like a hosted repository internally to your team, you're also going to get documentation and kind of test coverage. I use that word loosely, as a side benefit. So that's worth talking about. And the goal ultimately is that you can look at your application and be like, yeah, it's mostly this good. It doesn't have to be that good, but it's hopefully that good. So here's my two segues. Just, I know I feel like I hate being a rambling person because I just am, but these two segues, then we go into the process of, you know, what is CDD at like a dumb level of bullet points, or what is the process for it. So I want to quickly though talk about, you know, this is sort of in line with what is a component. If you've worked with Redux before, you might be familiar with the idea of like a container component. And these definitions are presented in different ways. It doesn't have to be used with Redux. And so if you've been in the React world, you might be familiar with this, but really you can start to define components further based on whether they're feature components or whether they're presentational components. Or that's the way I kind of talk about it. And the big difference being that, you know, the feature or container components are the things that are like, you know, they're the brains of the application more so. They are, that doesn't mean that there's not brains elsewhere, but they are the more of the business logic and application brain management areas. They're the pages, things, you know, I wrote a bunch of examples here. We don't have to go through all of them, but, you know, like a comment list maybe, or some type of messaging component to other users. Whereas things on the presentational side, those are strictly visual elements. They are things that result in some type of DOM output to the actual HTML once the React component compiles down. And generally what you'll see is the things on the right are more reusable and the things on the left are less reusable. And so this is just one way to start at least defining components a little bit more. But the important thing that I wanted to highlight here is that, and we're going to talk about these for a few more slides, but the important thing is that you can apply CDD to things on both sides of the equation, right? If you've ever worked with, I thought I had another slide in here, but let me see. Okay, yeah, I do. So we'll go over it in a minute. I'll skip that for now. But this is kind of a way to look at it. Things on the left are less reusable, things on the right are more reusable. But there's still that gray area in the middle of, a lot of times you also want to build reusable kind of feature components, right? Like maybe you have a good example of something that, you know, we work on at Fleetio is we have this comment list that can be used across multiple record types. And this is kind of a thing that I'm still trying to build with its abstract, or at least slightly more abstract API, so that I can use it across different record types. But it's a reusable component, and it's, you know, what is it? I don't know. So I don't really think about feature versus presentational in terms of reusability. I strictly keep it to this definition. A feature or a container component is something that is highly coupled to your application data. And if you're using like Redux, that means it's highly coupled to like your global state. Whereas a presentational component is something that it basically can do its jobs with the instructions you give it through its props, and that it needs to be able to do that job in a generic way, so that I could use it in this project over here, or I could use it over here in another project. And even if you're only working in one project, you're like, well, I don't need to do that. I only work on this. I mean, it doesn't matter. You're still going to make better components with this mindset, and you're going to open yourself up for more opportunities to compose higher level components that you might not if you just go in and, you know, build like you're working on a Rails ERB template or something. And so this is the thing I wanted to circle back on. Specifically, the sandbox examples today are kind of oriented around these presentational components, but you know, CDD can work across the full front-end React stack. And if you've ever done anything like mocked a JSON file with, you know, backend data, or made a mock service worker, or even just mocked your state, in a feature component, that's still kind of CDD in my mind, because you're really thinking through that API first of what data you're going to need for a page or a feature. And then you're building to that API without, waiting on the actual API. And it's kind of a similar idea when you're dealing with these presentational components. The main difference is that you really actually want to develop presentational components in some type of sandbox, which is the first step of CDD for Dummies. So that's to ensure, in the same way that you would build a feature component without hitting your API, whether it exists or doesn't, it's really to ensure that you can build these presentational components in a way that it's decoupled from the feature component. Because nothing's going to stop you from like going and making a new page in your app and just, starting to make what you think is a generic component. And you might do a good job of that, but the temptations are too real if you don't build within a sandbox. So anyways, we're focusing on the right today, but this is a big, vague concept that applies to everything. Second segue, test-driven development. I'm going to be honest, I'm a terrible developer because I tend to, on the front end, I've never been able to do TDD. I tried to think about it and say, well, let me write down why I can't do TDD. And I'm using TDD as an analogy here because I think most developers are familiar with it. If you're not, you'll learn about it in the next couple slides as I compare it to CDD. But my reasonings kind of boil down to this, that I do use TDD a fair amount if I'm dealing with some type of class or module, whether on the front end or the back end, where there's like a clear input or an output. That could be like an API, like a REST API. It could be just calling a function, right? Like there's some type of clear expectations of what I'm giving to something and what I'm getting back. But really, when you're developing on the front end, there's like that third dimension of what does it look like, or what does it feel like, or how does it work? And maybe you can do snapshot testing to cover some of that stuff on the front end, but ultimately when you're building the first time through, a lot of times there's no real way to write test case out for that. You could write test cases out for like accessibility requirements and stuff, but hopefully I'm not alone in saying that TDD doesn't translate well here. A few other reasons. Obviously you're also coding in 3 languages on the front end. So sometimes I'm just figuring out what I need to build. And I've built a lot of stuff on the front end, and I'm still always going back and figuring out again how I should build the next thing. And a lot of that's just because there's new stuff coming out all the time, but a lot of it's just because that stuff goes in one ear and it's gone, dude. I wipe it from my brain. And then of course there's that visual cycle that I've talked on before that is natural for front end development. And then most of all, like most of the time when you're given a design to build, a lot of that changes by the end of it. So, good luck with TDD there. And that's kind of true in all development, but especially on the front end. So that's me saying TDD on the front end is hard, and I will scream it from the rooftops. And I don't want to carry that shame anymore that I haven't been doing it. So I hope all of you forgive me. And if you are good at TDD on the front end as is, please speak up later and tell us what I'm missing. But now this is the kind of, we're about to get to the code sample. I want to go through these 3 or 4 steps to what is CDD. So this is, if you take anything away, this is what I want you to go try to do if you haven't done this before. So like TDD, you need some type of testing environment or a sandbox. And this is basically to give you an isolated place where you don't have to worry about standing up a new component and rendering a component. You can do this. I've done this in Create React app before, especially when I'm trying to prototype out like maybe a more complicated, example of some type of thing I'm working on. You can do this in something like Storybook, which some of you may have heard of. And that's, like a self-hosted, it's a very extensive sandbox environment. Docs is what I've been using recently. It's more of a lightweight sandbox environment that's more opinionated towards being a documentation site. But you basically get your own little isolated sandbox examples, and I find it works well. And you get like documentation out of it at the same time, or you could just use CodePen. And so the important thing here is you need to pick the tool, what you think is appropriate for what you're trying to do. But you need to get an isolated environment that is not your app effectively. And of course, I'm not going to read the right side as much. So then the second step here is that go ahead and start thinking out what is like the definition of your component, similar to how in the TDD world, you would maybe go through and start writing out some failing use cases or some failing test cases. You really want to do the same thing here. And obviously, like just putting these screenshots on the page, it's like, oh, that was just thought out in an instant. But no, I mean, really the process is going through and thinking out your API as you are defining these test cases in your sandbox. And what these are going to basically turn into is all the use cases that you need to support that you can then go build the component out to do. And things will just magically start appearing on the screen as you build out to the requirements. This is a sample I took from something, clearly, I don't know where, but you can see like I have a button component and I'm rendering out different variations of that button component with different props. Things like icon are disabled or colored. Sorry, I'm just seeing what time it is. So then the next step, and this is really the last step, it's a pretty easy process. You build it, right? You use that sandbox, you go build it like you would build a normal feature. You do the visual iteration back and forth. And it's ultimately the same thing you would probably have to build anyways if you were just building the feature on its own. But by ensuring that you're building it in this decoupled way from the get-go, like you're going to have a better deliverable on the other side of that. And that's a similar value proposition for why people say to do TDD, right? Is because, not only are you going to get these test cases already written from the get-go, but you're going to have a more thought out implementation. So ultimately what I meant to say is TDD on the front end is easy. It's just actually called CDD. And so that's my big revelation. To kind of put this in one slide, and this is something you might could reference if you want to look at this later. There's some links to some of the sandboxes. There's definitely more out there. CDD as a terminology in the React world has gotten pretty popular in the last year or so. So there's a lot of Google content out there. But get yourself a sandbox. Step 2 is define your component. That means not just the prop API, but also what is the potential structure. And I'm going to go through this in the sandbox examples to kind of demonstrate this process. And then the next step really is, as you think out your prop API, start implementing, and you can repeat that process. Like a lot of times you're not going to get the prop API perfect, as you're first building through, and you might tweak things as you think through what does this mean for who's using that component. And then the end of the line is that you then take this component and you use it in your feature and it's done. And that's why this is such a powerful tool to use at times, is because if you look at a spec that like maybe a designer gives you and you got a feature you have to build for your project, you're going to have to code it either way. I mean, if you're using something like Bootstrap or something, like ignore it. That's not what I'm talking about. But if you are having to go implement some custom design, you're going to have to build all of that. And so if you go ahead and just build it right from the get-go by identifying the components and taking like a CDD approach, you're going to get something that you can then use in other components later. So it's not here nor there in terms of this being more effort. It's just more about, this is more of an inside-out approach in a way than it is top-down. And I also want to bring up that this works for simple components, which that's more what the examples are today. But it can be composite components, which there's an example of that, or something that's like much more complex. Like say you want to build some like, drag and drop or resizing or some type of interaction that you don't even know what the API you're going to use for that is, like at the JavaScript level. Like you can go start with a prop API and use that as like, all right, I know this is what I need in and out of this component. So how do I make this happen? And let that help guide you to build it. So, all right, code samples, disclaimer. I've tried to keep this code as simple as possible. I've also pre-coded this stuff. So we'll see how easy it is to fake through this process. I definitely did the process for real the first time through though. And I'm using Tailwind and like maybe one other dependency. But ultimately, I tried to keep this as like close to React as possible and just really simple logic. So it's more about the process than it is the code that I'm about to deliver to you all. So let's do it. So these are the samples. We're going to go through an avatar, an activity card, and a mystery component. Before I start this, does anyone have any questions so far? I don't want to open up for too many questions, but if anyone needs clarification on anything on these slides, before we jump into this, please ask now. All right, that was a short enough break. So let me jump into the code editor, and we can do questions later. I will try to put this side by side. So this is docs. This is what I've been using as a sandbox recently, and this is kind of the idea that it gives you a sandbox, but you also get these components at the end of it. This kind of came with their docs sample site, so you can see we have, and it's like a basic component documentation thing. This is, I'm sure most of you all are familiar with stuff like this, but this is their sample alert that comes with it. So you can see like the sandbox with examples, and I think you can actually edit it. I don't do that too much. And then, here's their examples, but that's not what we're here for. We're here to make our own. So this first example, and technically, if you look at the second example, this is probably what you would get from a designer, unless your design team is more thoughtful in regards to component stuff. But you probably would start with this, and you'd have to say, actually, there's more to this. Like, I can break this down further. But for the purposes of building up in the example, I'm going to start with the broken down one. And where I would start here essentially is, I'm going to just side by side this for now. And let's see. So I have the finals, and we're going to ignore those. So I would jump straight to my sandbox. So this is an MDX file. I can write JSX within these playgrounds. But this is going to obviously be different based on where you choose to use a sandbox. And obviously, I've already skipped the part of me thinking up what is the name I'm going to use. But sometimes that's important, and I'll talk about that more in a later example. Based on the visual requirements alone, which is, hopefully you have actual written down requirements as well, we are going to make something that has an image avatar. And if there isn't an image provided, we want to show the initials. So I would sit down and I would start by basically just writing out what I expect that to be. And there's not going to be any content here, but I know I'm going to need some type of name information, just, obviously from the visuals alone. And this would be a point in time where I make a determination, like, do I want to take the full name of somebody? Do I want to make the person that uses this split the names up for me? And that's obviously going to depend. For the simplicity's sake, I'm just going to make sure that that is provided by, the consumer of this component. So we'd have like a first name and a last name. And we'd also have some type of image. And I have an image over here. 1 second. And that is not going to pass the linter, but that's okay because I don't have a linter set up. And then there's also sizes, right? So I'm going to start with just making up some sizes here. I mean, if you're working in a team environment, you probably would define these better. But what did I write earlier? So we'll say medium as the default. And then I'm just going to copy and paste this because this is a sandbox and I don't care. We'll make some other sizes. How about large? And sorry. And I'm going through this a little bit faster now just for time, but this is something that this is the point in time, especially if this is a more complicated component where you start thinking this stuff through. So now I will go actually to the avatar, and I see I have my sandbox with examples. It's not that great on half of the screen, but there's no output yet. So this is really, ultimately where what you're working on starts coming to fruition here. So I would come in here and, based on my visual example, I know what my props are. I have an image source. I have a first name. I have a last name. If y'all can hear me typing, forgive me. It's right next to my keyboard, my mechanical keyboard. And let's see, I guess, we could do this in a lot of different ways, but I'm just going to make it easy initially and say, if there's an image source, then we'll just go ahead and return an image directly. And I'm going to do an image tag. Let's see. This is Tailwind class. so this is funny. I'm gonna leave this, as a prop that we want to fill out later that we do need to pass some type of alt text through, but I don't know what that's gonna be just yet. So right there, this would usually be a point in time where, sorry, I go and check, like, is this code actually doing anything? And clearly I already messed something up, so it's a good thing I'm checking. Cool. So I'm getting close, not close enough. So the first thing I'm going to do is, like, let's just go ahead and handle the styles. So I'm just going to define the styles as like a map up here for now, because that's kind of the most straightforward thing. And these are just going to correspond with tailwind sizes, just because that's the easiest. And I want to make a size, right? So then I should at least get these as sizes. No, I did not, because I did not get it out of the props. Okay, I messed that up as well. That actually is this is the correct tailwind. So this is probably not exactly the code I would push to production, and we can make it better, but all right, got some sizes. We're getting there. I'm also going to start working on, well, what am I going to return if I don't have a potential, image source given to me. And in this case, I am probably going to, we're going to need to figure out how to get the initials out of the first and last name. So, but I'm going to go ahead and style it first, because I've already started working on these styles. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and pull in. So this is another thing, especially if you're working with Tailwind in the React world. This is essentially, it's actually a very old package, but it lets you kind of conditionally apply class names. So it kind of gives you a little bit more of that, like, CSS and JavaScript capability. So let's see. This is probably going to be some type of base style that I'm going to reuse for both of these. And then I'll do the, let's see, base style. Actually, I only need the base style here, sorry. For this one though, what do we got to do? It needs a background, it needs to be white. So let's see, I'm going to apply the base class. I'm going to, and this essentially just composes different classes on top of each other. So text is going to be white, the background is going to be gray. I'll say 500. And I also want the text content to obviously be centered. So I will justify it. This is just using flex stuff. And yeah, let's go with that for now. We'll see how that works. And then I also need to figure out how to render the initials themselves. So let's take the first name and just slice the first letter off of it. And then we'll do the last name. This probably would break on some edge cases, but that's okay, because I don't have those edge cases right now. And then we're going to see how close we're getting. Okay, we're not close at all, because I need to actually render those examples. And you'll see, like, as you're doing this, you're basically building out documentation for your team, or even if it's not for your team, you're kind of building yourself some visual test cases that you can come and reference later, especially if you're working on, especially if you're working on things and you're refactoring components at a later time. Like, having these kind of persistent visual use cases, it's a very helpful thing. Okay, that's kind of ugly. So then maybe, let's say, I don't know, let's apply a different text size. So this is more the API of class names, but what I can do is just test if it is of a certain size. I think that's correct. Basically, what I'm saying is, if the size they gave me is one of these, I want to use this class as my font size. Okay, yeah, that looks smaller. Okay, and I'm done. Well, actually, am I done? I don't know, I need this. So we'll just make a, I don't know if this is proper accessibility, but there. So that's the first example. And that basically is the process, no matter if you're starting with a small component or a more complicated component. You sit down, you write out your examples, and then you go build to those examples. So I'm going to jump through these next ones a little bit faster just because we're already at 12:40. But the next one would be, all right, let me sort of full screen this. It's essentially a list of cards, which I have deemed the activity card, where we have some type of timestamp, a title, content area, and then we get to use our avatar. And really, this is more of a composite component. Like if this was a normal UI component I was building, I probably would already have like some text components I could use, maybe even like a time component that, or a duration component or a time ago component. So this would be a composition of components in my mind, but we've only built the avatar for now. So, you know, we're going to skip that. And you're not always going to have the perfect components ready to go. And, you know, sometimes you have to make sacrifices. So this one, though, I want to start with the MDX, and then we'll just copy and paste in the actual code just because we're running out of time. So let's see. I need some data for this, and this is somewhat similar. I'm starting to get more copy and pasty here just because, again, I should have timed this a little better. But you know, similar to if you were building this anywhere, I can add in a bit more. Sorry, 1 second. I'm going to start scaffolding out some prop data just to make this a little bit easier on myself. But I have gone through and thought about essentially that I'm going to need some type of date time so I can render some type of time ago. I need a title prop. I need a content prop. And then I'm going to need avatar props to render my avatar. And so that is what I have defined already here. So avatar props, which if you're working in a component library, you know, your users or your developers are probably going to know, hey, that should be the same props that I'm expecting over here. So we have the avatar props, a title, I guess I named content message, and then a date. And I've done some additional dates so we can test the time ago functionality. So let's see. All right, activity card, nothing is there. So again, I would go through this process. In this case, copying and pasting, I'm no longer thinking about this, but let me give you what the end component would be. So let's pretend that I've been working on all of this stuff. I got to this point. Oh, and there's my component, right? So I do wish I could have gone through that one in a little bit more detail, but I think doing questions or any other discussion is probably more important at this point because the process is the same as what we demonstrated on that first one. But the last thing I wanted to highlight here is that this can be applied not just for these kind of visual, you know, these visual examples that are only outputting UI. And so let's say that, you know, your product manager is in like, all right, you made this for me. Now I want people to be able to drag and drop the cards on that timeline. And generally what I would recommend in that case is asking them why and not doing it. But in this case, we're like, whatever, we're going to give the people what they want. Like, how can I make this thing drag and droppable? So this is where things start getting a little bit more in the territory of sometimes you just need to think about what should my component structure be. I'm going to just change slides here because I don't want y'all getting distracted by him. But I can, you know, off the bat, if I'm trying to make some type of generic drag and drop thing my goal here is going to be, I want to make some type of component that will make other components draggable and droppable. Now, obviously there's limitations to that, but I can kind of think of two API or two setups for that off the bat. And one of them would be doing something like this, like a draggable list. Where I have some type of draggable item that is, you know, a child of that list. And for now, let's just put like a div in here. So this would be one API, and I mean, maybe it would be more flexible, I'm not sure, but this is the part of the process when I'm thinking out what my props should be or what my component definitions should be, that I will maybe come and say, you know what, this is going to require keeping up with some type of state between these parents and children, probably using some type of context provider or something else. And for the purposes of a React Lunch and Learn, like that's way too complicated from where I want to go. So I'm going, even if it might be a better API or look cleaner, I am going to assume that actually I want my component to manage both the rendering of items and, you know, managing that internal order state. And so this would look something more like, one second. I'm going to just do a render prop pattern, right? And so I know that I'm now managing the rendering of those items. So I can say, I'm going to need some type of items, which is probably like an array. I'm going to need the consumer of this component to tell me what to do with those items. And for now, we would just render a div. And I'm also going to probably need some type of, callback that says that I can, provide to the user when the ordering of those items change, right? So this, you can almost think in a way, this is like an input, right? Like there's like a value and a non-value change. And you start to think about a lot of things in the React world as just inputs with values and change handlers when you get more into this mode of like component, building from the bottom up. But anyways, for the purposes here, that's kind of the process you would go through. This is more the end playground. Whoops. Where I'm kind of copying and pasting some data in so that I can render some activity cards in my render item. My items are just this data above. And I have some type of callback, which, maybe we go save this information on the server. I don't know, but that's not the purpose of this component. The purpose of this component is just to tell me what the order is. And then likewise, I'm going to go copy paste the completed component in light of time. Oops. And we'll go check out that completed component. Okay. So I honestly, I'm crazy for thinking I could have fit this in an hour, so forgive me. But I'll know for the next React Lunch and Learn, which there's no more of them. So, but you can see I now have my draggable thing. I can sit here and test it in the sandbox. Maybe it's not the best UX. Maybe you want to improve it, make it more touch friendly for mobile devices. But again, I have my completed thing that works in isolation, and I could even probably come here and I haven't actually tested this, but we'll do this one live. Like maybe let's actually just return and make sure this works with something else. Hello, hello. All right. Yeah, so you can't tell here. I need some type of index, which let's see. I have an index, so let's pass the index to render item. Now I have an index, and this is the process of component-driven development, right? Like I'm flexing things as I, as I'm kind of iterating back and forth. Let's see. I don't know. Why is this not working?
You can put
Anyways,
the whole thing and then do a template string.
yeah, we'll try that.
Or a string literal.
Oh, there is something. Whoops. All right. Well, all right. Y'all clearly, let me see. We're not ready for that. Item index. Yeah, I don't know. But I don't want to waste more time on this right now, because it's already 12:51. So anyways, oh, sorry, let me share a few more slides. There's some resources here. I actually have put together some interesting readings. Not all of them are directly component-driven development related. The sample project is also at this location. And so I guess Jennifer can get this presentation to people. And then just, also Fleetio is going to be hiring a lot of engineers over the next year. It's not why I did this presentation, but that might be interesting information to you. Our stack is evolving daily towards more and more React, and we're doing a lot of this stuff. So anyways, forgive me for taking so much time. Is there any questions before people have to start dropping off?
I have a dumb question. What are there any downsides that you've encountered?
I mean, there is, especially if you're like working on a team and you're having to manage a hosted sandbox, like there's some additional maintenance and Webpack configs, because most of these are JavaScript driven, that you have to deal with, and that's annoying always. But I think a CDD is more like a mindset, and honestly, it goes beyond React. Like this is really a mindset you can take into other front end development environments. So I see no downside to it in that regard.
Yeah, I'm a fan.
I have a question. I have this tension in my head between wanting things to be really nicely decoupled, but also avoiding unnecessary abstraction. Is that something that you've encountered in component-driven design, and trying to figure out how much, maybe with designing prop APIs, like, is this going to change? Is it what? Maybe it won't change.
It's certainly something you have to deal with. But I don't think that means you have to make the most amazing components when you start with a more lower level component. Like a lot of the components I've built at times are, you look on the insides of them and you're like, dear God, like help me. It doesn't have to be the perfect implementation, but I do think that it's worth spending the time to get that prop interface as close to generic as it needs to be, because that's the thing that's going to be harder to change later, right? Like once your component's like out into the system, that's going to be a more significant refactor. And that's what you want to try to avoid. So yeah, if you're looking at something that is some type of super UX, or sorry, some type of super novel UX that you don't see a lot of reusability coming around the system, then I might still recommend building in a sandbox just to prototype it out and understand how you want it to work. Because like I said, you have to do the work either way. And you may end up making it more generic than you thought you could. But at the same time, there is that balance of, well, let me go build it over here first, kind of as a one-off for this feature. And then maybe next time when I know I need to use it again, then let me port it to the sandbox and make it a component. So maybe think of it like that. But in general, especially when it comes to like the lower level things or things that are just outputting visual stuff, like I would try to build those as presentational components from the get-go. Even if it's, even if you're using something like Bootstrap components and they're React flavored, there could be something that's a composition of Bootstrap components. So maybe you're not building the buttons and the inputs, but you're making an input button composition, right? And you can do that in like a sandbox environment and keep that nice and decoupled.
Thank you.
Great presentation. Thanks.
Well, yeah, I'm on the Slack too. So if y'all have other questions, or y'all look through the slides and have other questions, or you look at the project and have questions, like you can just hit me up there. But that's all I got.
Cam, thank you.
Thank you.
That was great. I posted this in the chat, but Trend Micro, our sponsor, gives away 4 Uber Eats gift cards every Lunch and Learn, and I just did a random number generator for that one. And so Hunter, Kevin, Michael, and Craig, send me your email addresses for that, and I'll get those Uber Eats to you. Thanks so much, Ham, for spending this time talking with us. If you'll just send me your slide deck, I'll get it out to everybody. I'm going to follow this up with an email to the entire base group, just with the link to the recording, so you can watch it again or send it to friends, and the slide deck. And then also just a reminder about the holiday party. So check, I'll be posting that on Meetup, and then just RSVP on Eventbrite and choose your option if you'd like to get the free pickup from Hop City. Let's keep the conversation going. I look forward to 2021. We can still talk about React, still involved in front end, but we'll just expand it out and be able to talk about a little bit more as well. So have a great afternoon, everybody. See you next time.
Bye,
And feel
everybody.
free to hang out and ask questions if you got them. I'll be here for a bit.
Thanks, Ham. That was awesome.
Yeah, I'll see y'all later.
See you, Ham. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer, as always, for hosting.
Absolutely. Thanks for asking a question. Good one.
Thanks, everyone. It was fun.
Thanks, Evan. Good to see you. I'll see you in a few weeks.
Yep. All right. See y'all.
I'm normally too shy to ask questions because I feel like I'm going to just look totally stupid. So I just went ahead and
No,
embrace it.
it's great. I love it. Good for you. I want to watch that again. I'm thinking about like the difference between that and just kind of thinking about like a design system. A design system with component library seems to kind of cover a lot of that. That approach, but then expanding that out and thinking about that beyond those UI components. It's an interesting thing to think about. Okay, cool. Let me see if I actually got 4 email addresses. Yes, I did.
Well, I'll catch you later.
All right, see you, Riley.